And let not anyone think it foolish, so to venture along a path which many philosophers are fleeing from. For in the first place, I do not esteem any human agency so formidable that a wise man can ever be terrified by it. And in the second place, I would not urge upon you the pursuit of bravery, unless it were attended with danger. What drives Philostratus' biography of Apollonius of Tyana is a war between two dominant forces in ancient life. On the one hand, philosophy, with Apollonius as its champion, the kind of life that is concerned with big questions, with seeking knowledge and understanding, asking things about oneself, and always wanting to improve oneself and even change your opinions. Opposing philosophy is tyranny, with Domitian as its primary representative in this work. The biography builds up to a clash between these two titans, Apollonius and philosophy against Domitian and tyranny. And even though we only meet Domitian at the end of the work, the conflict between the examined life and the unexamined life dominates the story from the very beginning. In fact, in the first sentence, Philostratus introduces us to his two combatants. On the one hand, Sophia, or wisdom, and on the other hand, Tyrannus, or tyranny. The book's core theme is how Apollonius shows up for and embodies philosophy, especially when confronting anti-philosophical opinions, views, or even legislation. And we'll see how Apollonius always prevails over the unwise, whether they're ordinary people or even the most powerful men in the world. Throughout the biography, philosophy and the philosophical life help Apollonius to learn and grow, and to live beyond the reach of the enemy of freedom, which is tyranny. The message is clear. If you live a philosophical life, especially the kind of life espoused by Pythagoras and Pythagoreanism and Neo-Pythagoreanism, then you will be able to do things that ordinary people just simply cannot do. You will have access to powerful people, you can travel the world. You will potentially have access to magic powers, to supernatural things, and in fact, you may be worshipped as a god or something like a god, and you may even have access to immortality. In contrast, those who reject the philosophical way of life are humiliated, defeated, and thwarted at every turn. And it doesn't matter who you are. The lowliest soul can be lifted up by philosophical study, and kings are cut down by their ignorance and their vanity. This is the second video in my series on Apollonius of Tyana and his biography by Philostratus. The first one you can watch. I'll put a card somewhere and in the description below. So part one was a general introduction to the text and some of the major themes. Today what we're going to do is cover the first half of the work, book by book, especially where it concerns this conflict between philosophy and tyranny. My intention was to do the entire thing in one episode, but as I was writing it, there's just too much material to cover. So I apologize if having a part one and part two is kind of annoying. I know I get annoyed by that, but there's really nothing that we can do. There's so much material. What we'll cover today are books 1 through 4, where we get Apollonius's early life, his education, his journey out to India to meet the Indian sages, and the first indication that not everyone is friendly towards philosophy. So that's what we're doing today. If you're new here, welcome. This is Hearth of Haemonia. My name is Kate, and we talk about what people believed in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So today we're doing philosophy. We often do mythology, magic, religion, all sorts of things like that. Like I said, there's a lot to get through today, so without further ado, let's dive into the biography of Apollonius of Tyana. Philostratus begins the biography of Apollonius of Tyana with a discussion of Apollonius's role model, Pythagoras. We learn that Pythagoras was a reincarnated soldier who had fought at Troy, and who, in his life as Pythagoras, enjoyed this unique relationship with the gods. And he lived in a way that was unusual for his age. He was effectively a proto-vegan. He refused to eat meat, wear animal products. He wouldn't make blood sacrifice to the gods. And in this brief introduction, we get a couple of really important points for the biography going forward. Number 1, reincarnation is real, and it is possible for philosophers. Number 2, philosophers enjoy a special relationship with the gods. And number 3, Pythagoras and his followers believed in a proto-vegan lifestyle. Again, a lifestyle that was vegetarian plus not wearing animal products, using animal products in any way, or, like I said, making blood sacrifice to the gods. As a young man, Apollonius of Tyana had a robust philosophical education where he studied all different kinds of philosophical traditions, and he ultimately settled on Pythagoreanism as his model. So he wore his hair long, he walked barefoot, he was, again, proto-vegan. All he wanted to do was to learn from as many wise people as he could and teach people how to live a better, more fulfilling life, which is essentially the business of philosophers from the very beginning. You will note that Socrates also went around telling people how to live. And he spends some time living in the temple of Asclepius. So this is a healing temple, and people come to visit the temple, they make offerings to the god, and they ask for healing. Apollonius's role in this temple scene is to advise people who come to the temple for healing and to offer them his opinions and correct their behavior. When a young man comes to the temple seeking healing, he asks, "I want the health which Asclepius promises but never gives." And Apollonius replies, "He gives to those who desire it, but you do things that irritate and aggravate your disease. For you give yourself up to luxury, and you accumulate delicate viands upon your waterlogged and worn-out stomach, and, as it were, choke water with a flood of mud." In another instance, Apollonius has an opportunity to correct the behavior of his younger brother, who, in the absence of their parents have died, has become drunk and just walks around with a kind of bad temperament. So Apollonius gives him some advice and helps him out a little bit. So Philostratus tells us, "Accordingly he gave to him the half of his own share of the property, on the pretense that he, the brother, required more than he had, while he himself, Apollonius, needed little. And then he pressed him and cleverly persuaded him to submit to the counsels of wisdom, and said, 'Our father has departed this life, who educated us both and corrected us, so that you are all that I have left. And I imagine I am all that you have left. If therefore I do anything wrong, please advise me and cure me of my faults. And in turn, if you yourself do anything wrong, suffer me to teach you better.' And so he reduced his brother to a reasonable state of mind." So even though Apollonius is still a young man, he's able to give advice and correct people, first to someone who, it seems obvious that that person would need correction, this drunken guy who comes to the temple for healing. But then Apollonius gives advice and help to his brother, even though his brother is older than him. And then a little bit later, we see him interact with someone even more powerful and important. So Apollonius has this idea that he's going to go to India to study with the sages there. He has heard about them, they're supposed to be very wise, and so he makes his way east. And one of the first people that he encounters is the king of Babylon, a guy called Vardanes. And Vardanes is very friendly towards Apollonius, and in fact is willing to learn from Apollonius, and Apollonius gives him some advice. He helps him deal with an embassy that had been sent from Syria. So here we have young Apollonius advising a king. And this is significant not just to show that Apollonius is clever and is reaching into the highest circles. He's been invited to dine with kings and things like that, but also to show that good leaders, good kings, are willing to listen to philosophical reasoning. Knowledge, wisdom, argumentation, proof, all of these things are what help kings make informed decisions. Decisions that benefit and improve their own lives and the lives of their subjects. So how rulers and leaders respond to philosophy, especially respond to Apollonius as the representative of philosophy, is going to color how they are assessed throughout the life. Rulers who are more willing to use philosophical reasoning are considered good, and rulers who reject philosophy are evaluated as bad, and they are the tyrants, the enemies of philosophy. So the first king that Apollonius meets, this guy Vardanes, is evaluated to be good and reasonable, because he's willing to listen to Apollonius. Book 1 also establishes this undercurrent of supernatural powers. We see from the very beginning early evidence that Apollonius is not like other people. There are 2 portents that signal his birth, both of which involve strange dreams being sent to his mother while she's pregnant with him. In the first vision, she is visited by Proteus, who is a shape-shifting god. And she asks Proteus what kind of child she is going to have, and Proteus tells her that he will be like himself. Philostratus doesn't make us puzzle this out on our own. He tells us explicitly his interpretation. Proteus is knowledgeable, he is skilled in intellectual pursuits, he is versatile and adaptable, and he evades capture. The second dream involves Apollonius' mother going to sleep in a meadow, and then some reports of the dream say that she was surrounded by swans and she gave birth there, and in other reports a lightning bolt crashes to earth and rises up again. Keep that in mind as we go forward. When you are writing about extraordinary figures, it's not unusual to have a dream foretell their incredible birth, or to foretell the birth of a person that is going to be extraordinary. One of the most famous examples of this is from Herodotus' histories, where before the birth of Cyrus, his grandfather Astyages has a dream that his daughter Mandane grew a vine out of her back that stretched across the whole of Asia. And Cyrus does ultimately grow up to conquer ever more territory. And even in Suetonius' biography of Augustus, he reports that his mother Attia, quote, dreamed that her vitals were borne up to the stars and spread over the whole extent of land and sea, and that his father dreamed that the sun rose up out of her womb. Now, of course, imperial propaganda for Augustus said that Augustus would ultimately be apotheosized up to heaven and become a god when he dies. So this is a standard practice for ancient authors to show that a person is going to be beyond the usual in their life. So we get 2 dream portents for Apollonius. And book 1 is where we see Apollonius perform his first extraordinary feats. I mentioned 2 of them in the first video. Apollonius predicts how long he will be in Babylon because he finds a dead animal and he's able to work out what the dead animal means. And then the second one, when he uncovers the secret that a eunuch in the palace had been sleeping with one of the maidens in the palace, he makes that prediction, and then that prediction comes true. Both of these episodes, and there's another one where he has a dream prophecy that has to do with a fish, these are certainly out of the ordinary, But prophecy, and especially interpretation of omens, is standard practice for religious figures. Apollonius considers himself a religious person. And I'll give one more example from Apollonius's time at the temple of Asclepius. A man comes into the temple looking for a cure for his blindness, and Apollonius advises the priests not to do anything and says that Asclepius won't help this man. And in fact, Asclepius visits the priests in a dream and explains that this man was blinded by his wife after she discovered that he was cheating on her, and not just cheating on her, but cheating on her with his stepdaughter, presumably her own daughter. So she blinded him and herself, as often people do in ancient literature. Even though Apollonius has figured this out, and what he predicted came true, there isn't any concrete indication that he has done so by supernatural means. Prophets, or mantes, appear elsewhere in Greek and Roman literature. Figures from mythology, like Tiresias or Cassandra. Priests and priestesses who work at oracles, like Delphi, Dodona, even the Sibyl of Cumae. And then the regular interpretive responsibilities of priests who oversaw sacrifice. So you sacrifice an animal, and then you look at its organs, and based on different formations in the organs, that will give you an answer to whatever the question is. Should we go to war? Should we do this? What we can say by the end of Book 1 is that Apollonius is at best an interpreter of supernatural things, and he has a keen, observant eye. Let's see how things progress as we go through the following books. Early on in Book 2, Apollonius faces off against a monster. This monster is called an Empusa, and it has the power to shapeshift. So the Empusa is not very well represented in Greek and Roman literature, but it seems to be a shape-shifting kind of demon creature who very often takes the form of women to lure men in, to seduce men, and then to feast on their flesh and blood. So in this instance, thankfully, no one is victimized by the Empusa, and Apollonius banishes it by yelling mean things at it, which apparently is the cure. That's how you get rid of an Empusa, is just to yell mean things at it. But in Book 4, Apollonius actually has to rescue a younger follower, this guy named Menippus, who is seduced by this woman. Apollonius says, "Hey man, I know you're gonna meet up with that woman later, but just so you know, she's a demon and you shouldn't engage with her at all." So it's a short episode. There's not a lot of detail. It's not like a big thing in the biography, but we can add defeating an Empusa to Apollonius's list of mystical accomplishments. Apollonius's main companion throughout his travels, and indeed throughout his life, is a guy called Damis. He meets Damis in Nineveh, where Damis offers himself up as a translator for Apollonius. Of course, Apollonius says he doesn't need it because he knows every human language and the sounds of silence. But he does let Damis come with him on his travels, and like I said, he stays with Apollonius for his entire life. And Damis is someone who wants to learn philosophy, but has never trained in philosophy. So Apollonius has the opportunity and takes the opportunity to teach philosophy to Damis. And in Book 2, we see a lot of their early conversations. And these are just great because they demonstrate how philosophy was done, how philosophy was taught to beginners. So we're not dealing with high-minded metaphysics. We're not discussing the nature of the soul or what matter is or any of the more complicated philosophical ideas. We are just practicing how to do philosophy with subjects that are very accessible to a beginner. And they use what they are observing as they travel. Remember, they're on their way from Nineveh all the way out to India. So what do they see? They see elephants. And so one of the early conversations that Apollonius has with Damis, where he's training him in philosophy, they use elephants as the subject. So they see a young boy, I think they said he's like 13 or something, riding an elephant, and Apollonius asks Damis all of these questions, beginning with questions about horses and horsemen, which would be something that Damis was already familiar with. He asks what makes a good horseman. What do horsemen do? How do horsemen train horses? What's the difference between a regular horseman and, say, mounted cavalry? And he has Damis work through all of these questions, and then he turns the subject to the boy and the elephant. And he asks Damis what the difference is between this boy who is riding this elephant and a horseman. What is the difference, do we think, between horses and elephants? How do you train an elephant? How do you manage such a massive animal? What is it in the nature of elephants that makes it possible for someone who is so young and so small to be able to control an animal of that size? So at first, Damis says this boy is amazing. He has conquered this massive animal. He is so impressive. And he just heaps praise upon this boy. And then Apollonius kind of gently comes in and shows that elephants are docile and friendly, and if you're nice to them, they are willing to submit to people. They don't seem to mind being around humans as long as humans are friendly towards them, and so on. So what he's doing is training Damis, not just, Damis has to make the leap between what he knows about training horses and what he imagines about training elephants. And the difference here lies in what you can observe about elephants. So Apollonius is teaching Damis to look carefully at elephants and watch them and see what they're like in order to figure out how such a small boy could manage such a large creature. This is way too brief of a summary just for time. I can't go through this conversation in detail, but I wanted to bring it up just to show how their relationship works. Apollonius is Damis's teacher, and on the other hand, to show Damis at the early stages of his philosophical journey. Once they reach what is now Pakistan, they meet a king there called Phraotes. This is one of the most important contacts that Apollonius makes throughout his travels. Why is that? Because Phraotes is a fellow wisdom seeker, like Apollonius, and yet he lives in a faraway place that is outside the scope of the Roman Empire. But he speaks Greek, he appreciates the Greek way of thinking. Like Apollonius, and like all philosophers should be, Phraotes is concerned with wisdom and good ideas, regardless of where they come from. He's after knowledge. He's not after knowledge only from a specific place. So he has studied philosophy, he's aware of Greek philosophy, and he has studied with the Indian sages. So he's able to tell Apollonius a little bit about what they're like before Apollonius meets them. And when Apollonius meets Phraotes, he says to him, "I am delighted, O king, to find you living like a philosopher." Remember, we are evaluating leaders on their relationship to knowledge and wisdom. Phraotes is someone who Apollonius can talk to as his intellectual equal. They do philosophy in the way that Apollonius was teaching Damis earlier, but they're able to do so with topics that are more complex. And one of the main things about philosophy, one of the main methods of philosophy and philosophical instruction is through dialogue. So the conversations that they have, where each of them lays out their arguments, that is how philosophy is done. So for example, one day when they wake up, they talk about sleep, what makes someone sleep well, and why philosophers maybe get better sleep than others. So here's a paraphrase of how that conversation goes. Phraotes says, "Apollonius, you must be awake this morning, because you don't drink wine. Apollonius says, oh, do people who only drink water not sleep at all? And Phraotes says, they do, but they sleep very lightly. Apollonius says, seems to me like they sleep deeply. It's important to quiet the mind for good sleep, which is why madmen never get good sleep. Their mind is always racing. Phraotes says, okay, obviously a drunk person won't sleep very well in that case, but what about someone who drinks wine but who isn't drunk, who just has a little bit of wine? And then Apollonius lays out an argument for why any substance, wine, drinks designed to put people to sleep, your chamomile tea, all of these things inhibit the mind, and thus they inhibit sleep. He says, yeah, even drinks that are meant to put you to sleep, they end up fogging your mind, and you wake up in a fog as well. And this is why Apollonius avoids all of these things. He doesn't have a moral objection to people drinking wine, but he avoids them because in his mind, no pun intended, the mind is the most critical thing and needs to be protected. So this is an example of how philosophy is done. You have a starting premise, oh, Apollonius must be awake because he doesn't drink wine. And then from there you argue all of these different points and try and come to a sense of, well, is it better to drink wine or not before bed? Philostratus is able to demonstrate how philosophy is done through these kind of conversations and show his readers, this is how you achieve philosophy. This is how you become a philosopher, is by practicing conversations like this. I wish I had more time to talk about Alexander the Great, because the area that they're in Book 2 is where Alexander the Great reached in his conquests. So there's a lot of really interesting discussions about Alexander the Great and history lessons about Alexander the Great that show up in Book 2. I don't really have time to talk about them, but it is worth noting that at the end of Book 2, Apollonius and Damis reach the furthest point that Alexander the Great got in his conquest, and they cross that boundary. So now Apollonius and Damis are, we'll say, beyond the edge of the known world, beyond the edge of Alexander's world at the very least. And so this is where the adventure can really begin. So you start to see more fantastical creatures and landscapes, and everything is more mystical and magical. And this is where the Indian sages live. Apollonius and Damis finally reach the home of the sages in India, and immediately they learn that the sages can make themselves invisible by manipulating clouds. As we explore the landscape of the sages' home, we learn that they have a special relationship with water, which they use for binding oaths, and with fire, which they use for purification. They apparently can collect fire from the sun's rays and store it levitating in the air somehow, and they themselves can levitate. Do you see where I'm going with this? The sages are evidently the most holy and wisest people that Apollonius has ever met, and he is anxious to learn everything that he can from them. And he discovers, much to his delight, that they live very similarly to the way that he lives. They worship Greek gods with Greek rites, of course. They're vegetarian. They grow their hair long. They live simply. They want for nothing. And they spend all of their time engaging in either religious or philosophical activity. In particular, they venerate the sun, which Apollonius also worships, so he's kind of already on the right track. And Apollonius asks them to study with them and to learn what he can from them, and of course they agree. We've been leveling up in our conversations as Apollonius gets closer to the sages, and now that he is with the sages, we can really pump up the philosophy and discuss super deep metaphysical, spiritual concepts, which Apollonius does with the head of the sages, this guy called Iarchas. One of the major things that they discuss is the concept of the immortality of the soul, and an extension of that, the possibility of reincarnation. If you remember, Philostratus tells us that Pythagoras himself had been reincarnated from one of the soldiers who fought at Troy, so we already have the idea of reincarnation floating around in the text. Evidently, Pythagoreans believed in reincarnation, and so that's where we get this from. Iarchas, again the head sage, tells Apollonius that he too was reincarnated from a mytho-historical king called Ganges, who is the son of the Ganges River. So Iarchas says that he had reconciled his father with the land and created the Red Sea, but that his people had killed him and they were cursed thereafter. So now Iarchas was the physical embodiment of this soul. And Apollonius seems to be aware of his own reincarnation, and he confirms for Iarchas that he too had been reincarnated, and that in a past life he had been the pilot of a ship, and he tells this story of an encounter that he had with pirates. It's important for Philostratus to establish the reincarnation and immortality of the soul, because on the one hand, he has said that Pythagoras was reincarnated, so now we get a discussion of how that's even possible. And on the other hand, the immortality of the soul is critical to the end of the story. But we're not there yet, we'll get there. Let's look at some more philosophy. As I said, Iarchas and the sages seem to be aware of Greek culture. They worship the Greek gods, they make references to Troy and the Trojan War, they know about Homer. And one Greek story that seems to have captured their attention is the punishment of Tantalus in the underworld and the judgment of Minos. Both of these characters end up in the underworld, but under very different circumstances. Minos in life had been the king of Crete, and his wife is responsible for bearing the Minotaur, so he creates the labyrinth. This is the guy that imprisons Daedalus and Icarus. After his death, he was given a place of honor in the underworld where he judges the souls of the dead. Tantalus, on the other hand, committed two unholy acts towards the gods. On the one hand, he revealed their secrets to humans, and on the other hand, he tried to trick the gods into eating human flesh. For this he was punished in the underworld. He was placed in a pool of water that he could never drink from, below a tree whose fruit he could never eat. In other words, punished with eternal hunger and thirst. Iarchas and the sages know this story, and they believe that the judgment of both characters is unfair. Iarchas explains, quote, "For here was Minos, a man who exceeded all men in cruelty, and who enslaved with his navies the inhabitants of continents and islands alike. And yet they honor him by placing in his hands a scepter of justice, and give him a throne in Hades to be umpire of spirits. While at the same time, they deny food and drink to Tantalus, merely because he was a good man, and inclined to share with his friends the immortality bestowed upon them by the gods. And some of them hang stones over him and rain insults of a terrible kind upon this divine and good man. And I would much rather that they had represented him as swimming in a lake of nectar, for he regaled men with that drink humanely and ungrudgingly." And he shows Apollonius later on, they have a statue of Tantalus, and they have a cup that is dedicated to Tantalus, and they use that for ritual purposes. So they're really, really big fans of Tantalus, and they don't approve of the end of Minos' story at all. And this argument has an impact on Apollonius, because later, when he and his followers visit Crete, all of his followers want to go see the labyrinth, right? You have to imagine this is so famous. They want to go see the labyrinth, and Apollonius won't go because he doesn't want to bear witness to Minos' cruelty. One more discussion here is worth noting, especially for regular viewers of this channel, because they very, very briefly talk about the elements. Iarchas explains to Apollonius and Damis that there are 5 elements: earth, water, fire, air, the usual ones, and ether. So this is the Aristotelian model of the elements. But he diverges from Greek philosophy when Apollonius asks him which of the elements was born first. Now, if you haven't watched our Elements series, basically Plato says that fire was born first. But in Iarchas' view, and again, remember, this is supposed to be the height of wisdom, these are the holiest and wisest people that there are, Iarchas explains that none of the elements were born first because the universe is this single living being filled with passion and harmony, and natural disasters are caused by imbalances in things like justice. And unfortunately, that is the full extent of their conversation. It's a very brief anecdote, but I wanted to mention it just because we have been working on the elements. Especially last year, we did a series on the elements on this channel, so if you saw that, this will be of interest to you. The last thing I want to bring up in Book 3 is an interaction that Apollonius has with a local king who has come to the sages for advice. They don't get off to a great start. The king refuses to entertain philosophy, and maybe even worse than that, he is not a fan of Apollonius' friend Phraotes. Of course, Apollonius praises Phraotes and says, actually, Mr. King, Phraotes had a lot of really nice things to say about you. And this seems to soften the king's attitude a little bit. And Apollonius and the king argue about the Persian wars. Of course, Apollonius defending the Athenians and the king sticking up for Xerxes and the Persians. But you'll be surprised that Apollonius gets the better of him in this conversation, and the king relents, even bursting into tears at how wrong he had been about Greek people. His judgment of Greek people was so off that he's reduced to tears. He's ashamed of himself. But Apollonius doesn't hold it against him, and they patch things up and become friends after that. In fact, Apollonius has a hard time getting rid of him. This guy keeps asking Apollonius to hang out, and Apollonius is like, oh, maybe later. So he has this total turnaround for this king. This episode is another example of philosophy winning over its enemies, that is, tyrants or kings that are not willing to rule through wisdom and intellectual inquiry. Here you have Apollonius not only able to have an audience with a king, to dine with a king and discuss history with a king, but in fact winning an argument against the king so thoroughly that the king is reduced to tears. It's a total defeat, but ultimately a benevolent defeat, because Apollonius just proves the king wrong and yet extends this kind of friendship towards him after that. Apollonius doesn't destroy the king, he just changes the king's mind. And we get the sense by the end of Book 3 that this king is now going to set off on a better path, a more philosophical path that will be beneficial not only to himself but to his subjects. And it's all thanks to our philosophy champion. Book 4 opens with Apollonius back in the Empire after he has learned all that he can from the sages. And this is a turning point for Apollonius because we see him shift now from his primary focus being on learning to now teaching. He begins in Ephesus, where he gives this big speech to the Ephesians about how they're living their life, and he has a lot of criticisms for them. He encourages them to pursue philosophy and intellectual studies rather than waste their time on what they have been doing, things like dancing, pantomime, other entertainments. So Philostratus summarizes. He says, quote, "For they were devoted to dancers and taken up with pantomimes, and the whole city was full of pipers, and full of effeminate rascals, and full of noise. So, though the Ephesians had come over to him, he determined not to wink at such things, but cleared them out, and made them odious to most of them." Apollonius kind of sees himself doing a public service by correcting the behavior of the Ephesians, and he does so just by explaining to them, through dialogue and through speeches, how their way of life is inappropriate and how better to live. So he preaches, and I do say this kind of in a religious sense, he preaches about living moderately and focusing on community. So these are the kinds of things that he's talking about. While he's there, a plague breaks out, which of course he foresees, right? This is a theme with him. He can see things ahead of time. And he tries to warn the Ephesians about this plague, but they don't heed his warnings. And so Apollonius sees the writing on the wall. He knows this is going to be bad. And so he leaves the city and he goes to another city nearby called Smyrna. While he's in Smyrna, he starts doing the same kind of things that he was just doing in Ephesus, preaching and advising people. When messengers come from Ephesus and say, "A plague has fallen upon us, Apollonius, you were right, we're so sorry, please help us." And Apollonius wants to help, but he's not going to do so in the usual way. Philostratus references an old trick, apparently something that Pythagoras himself could do, where he could be in two places at once. So Apollonius, in some form or another, returns to Ephesus without leaving Smyrna. We don't get any technical help for how this happened, whether one version of him was an apparition, like a hologram, an image of some kind, whether he cloned himself or split himself, or we don't get any of that. We just hear from Philostratus that Apollonius relied on this old thing that Pythagoras used to do, where he was in two places at once. In any case, Apollonius, in some form or another, was in Ephesus and was able to help the Ephesians with the plague. He notices that in the crowd, of course there's a crowd that gathers when he arrives, and he notices an old beggar who is in the crowd. And Apollonius encourages the people to stone this beggar because it's not actually a beggar, but it's a demon in disguise. And so the Ephesians stone this poor beggar, and this seems to get rid of the demon, and the plague is lifted from the city. So we have leveled up here in Apollonius' supernatural abilities, right? We're no longer just getting prophecies and him figuring stuff out now. He is able to actually perform, I don't want to use the word miracle, it's a little too religious, but something like that. Perform marvels, we'll say, where, regular people can't split themselves into two and be in two places at once. So it's clear that after his journey of discovery, where he goes out and talks to the sages and talks to Phraotes and learns from all of these different people, and by the way, I summarized, he learns from Arab nomads who teach him the language of the animals, he learns from the Magi, these are all people that Apollonius learns from. So at the end of that journey, now we see Apollonius can do some really interesting things. And again, the philosophical way of life gets you access to really special things. We'll see that in this next episode. So after he cures the Ephesians of their plague, Apollonius moves on to visit the tombs of the Greek fighters who died at Troy. Now, the local population warns Apollonius not to visit the tomb of Achilles because they believe that the ghost of Achilles is still at large and is terrorizing the population if bothered. So you shouldn't go and visit this spirit because he's an unfriendly one. Apollonius says, "No, I know Achilles. He wouldn't do anything like that." And so even though his companions don't want to go with him, by the way, Apollonius has gathered around him now a little posse in addition to Damis. So they don't want to go with him to visit the tomb of Achilles, but Apollonius goes by himself. And when he comes back, he starts doing all of these different things. He dismisses someone in his group, one of his followers, because it turns out the guy was of Trojan descent, and he says, "Well, I'm not supposed to associate with you." And he takes everyone on a detour to the tomb of Palamedes to go and make an offering there. And then he goes back to normal, and he has more of these philosophical discussions with his new followers, training them in the way that he trained Damis back when they were first setting out. And finally, Damis is like, hey man, are you gonna tell us what the deal is? What happened when you went to the tomb of Achilles? And so Apollonius describes what happened. Evidently, Apollonius had summoned the ghost of Achilles, using an Indian prayer, by the way, not a Greek prayer, an Indian prayer, and he met this apparition directly. And the ghost of Achilles allowed Apollonius to ask him 5 questions, which Apollonius did, and then Achilles answered them. So these are the questions. You can see them here on the screen. Number 1. Did Achilles get a burial like they said in the epics? And he says, yes, I was buried in the same urn as Patroclus, but I didn't get any music or fanfare or anything like that. Number 2, was Polyxena really slaughtered at his tomb? That is, the tomb of Achilles. Yes, she was, but she was not killed by the Achaeans. She was so devoted to him that she fell on her sword there. Number 3, did Helen come to Troy, or did Homer make it up? Wow, really exciting question here. No, she did not. Paris put her up in Egypt in the house of Proteus again, but the Achaeans, when they learned that, still finished the war to avoid embarrassment. Number 4, this is not really so much of a question, but Apollonius just remarks on how amazing it was that there were so many outstanding Greek warriors all at one time fighting in this war. And Achilles responds that, there were really outstanding Trojan warriors as well. Both sides had incredible fighters. And lastly, why did Homer A, not know about Palamedes, or B, purposely leave him out of the story? And Achilles says that Homer didn't want to shame Odysseus, who was responsible for Palamedes' death. And then Achilles' ghost tells Apollonius not to associate with the guy who was of Trojan descent and to make an offering at Palamedes' tomb. Here we have another instance of Apollonius getting access to supernatural things that ordinary people do not have access to. And he uses this extraordinary access to gain knowledge, which is always his first thought. His first thought when he encounters this ghost is to mine him for information, mine him for ideas, and answer questions that he has about this mytho-historical war. Now, it's not unusual for the hero of a grand adventure story like we have here to have an audience with a ghost. Typically, you have to go to the underworld to get this audience. This is called a katabasis. It's a part in the hero's journey where the hero has to go to the underworld and usually get information or prophecy from the spirit of someone who has died. So Aeneas goes to the underworld to talk with his father. Odysseus goes to the underworld. He talks to Tiresias. He talks to his mother. He talks to Achilles. You get a perversion of this in Book 6 of Lucan's Bellum Coele. And usually this happens at the halfway mark. So Aeneas's Katabasis is in Book 6 of 12. Odysseus is in Book 11 of 24. And in Lucan, the poem exists as 10 books, but it could have been 12 books, and the Katabasis, or the perversion of the Katabasis, appears in Book 6. Usually this is the halfway point. Book 4 is the halfway point of Philostratus' life of Apollonius of Tyana. So here we have a version of the Katabasis that is in some ways very, very different, but in other ways it has the core concepts of the hero speaks to someone who is dead and gets information. And we'll revisit the relationship that Apollonius has to the dead at the end of Book 4. Before we get there, though, we have to talk about Nero. Nero makes an appearance, boy does he make an appearance in Book 4, and he's the first emperor who is mentioned by name. As we wind down the first half of the story and get into the second half of the story, we shift from otherworldly spiritual leaders in far-flung places to the state of philosophy at home in the empire. So a good portion of Book 4 is dedicated to Nero's character and behavior and his interaction with philosophy. Apollonius never meets him directly. But, of course, Nero's policies spread around the empire and they affect everyone who lives in it. You may not be surprised at this point that the first reference that we get to Nero comes in the form of a prophecy that Apollonius gives that ultimately comes true. Apollonius is visiting the Isthmus of Corinth, and he says, quote, "This neck of land shall be cut through, or rather, it shall not be cut." And sure enough, Nero begins shortly thereafter the project of cutting through the Isthmus of Corinth, but ultimately he abandons this idea, and so it is in fact not cut through as predicted. And Apollonius continues to interact with the emperor indirectly. So while he's in Sparta, the Spartans receive a letter or a notice from Nero, essentially complaining about their conduct, and they ask Apollonius for advice about how to respond, and he advises them to take kind of like a middle path, to stick up for themselves but not to say anything that will get them in further trouble. Now, the most direct condemnation of Nero's character comes from a speech that Apollonius gives to his fellow philosophers, which we'll talk about in a minute. We'll get into like the context of the speech. But in this speech, Apollonius compares Nero to a wild beast. So it's worth reading a little bit of what he says. Quote, "In traversing more of the earth than any man yet has visited, I have seen hosts of Arabian and Indian wild beasts. But as to this wild beast, which many call a tyrant, I know not either how many heads he has, nor whether he has crooked talons and jagged teeth. In any case, though this monster is said to be a social beast and to inhabit the heart of cities, yet he is also much wilder and fiercer in his disposition than animals of the mountain and the forest. That whereas you can sometimes tame and alter the character of lions and leopards by flattering them, this one is only roused to greater cruelty than before by those who stroke him, so that he rends and devours all alike. And again, there is no animal anyhow of which you can say that it ever devours its own mother. But Nero is gorged with such quarry. It is true, perhaps, that the same crime was committed in the case of Orestes and Alcmaeon, but they had some excuse for their deeds, in that the father of the one was murdered by his own wife, while the others had been sold for a necklace. This man, however, has murdered the very mother to whom he owes his adoption by the aged emperor and his inheritance of the empire. For he shipwrecked and so slew her close to land in a vessel built for the express purpose of doing her to death." This is one of the most famous stories about Nero, about how he concocted this elaborate plot to kill his mother, and then when the plot failed, the plot was essentially to make it look like an accident, and then when that failed, he said screw it, and he just sent people to stab her. Whether this is really what happened or not is the subject for another video, maybe, but it's one of the most famous episodes from Nero's life, and it's a way that people can point to Nero's character and say, you know, he is so savage and so vile that he even killed his own mother. So that's what Apollonius is referencing here. So it seems that for Philostratus, the way that Philostratus characterizes Nero aligns with other ancient authors, other ancient assessments of him, and also how we as modern students of Roman history tend to see him. But Philostratus, of course, focuses on one aspect of Nero's character, and that is his relationship to philosophy and philosophers, his hostility towards philosophers. Philostratus says, quote, Nero was opposed to philosophy because he suspected its devotees to be addicted to magic and of being diviners in disguise. And at last the philosopher's mantle brought its wearers before the law courts, as if it were a mere cloak of the divining art. And we also learn that at this point several philosophers, including Musonius of Babylon, have been thrown into prison for practicing their art. And this is the state of things as Apollonius reaches the city of Rome. On his way into the city, Apollonius encounters a philosopher called Philolaus of Citium. Philolaus is on his way out of the city, and he warns Apollonius what's going on in there. He believes that philosophers should leave the city because they are being persecuted under Nero's no-good policies. He says that Nero's behaving very badly. He fights as a gladiator, and he rides in chariots in public. He sings songs in the theater. In other words, he is not the kind of leader that philosophers approve of, but really he's making a spectacle of himself. And Philolaus tells Apollonius not to go into the city, especially with a group of followers, because he's going to attract all of this attention and suspicion. Now, this encounter between Apollonius and Philolaus is really, really important because it is the first time that we get this question, the first time that we're dealing with this question. What should philosophers do in the face of tyranny? We've been building to this point for some time now, and Apollonius's response to Philolaus shows how strong he is, how devoted to philosophy he actually is. Does he change course and leave the city? Does he take his band of followers and turn around and run away from Nero? Of course not. He and those who are brave enough to go with him go on to enter the city to face off against the enemy of philosophy, that is tyranny. Most of Apollonius's followers choose not to join him. We learn that Apollonius at that point had 34 people with him, and only 8 go with him into the city. And Philostratus says, quote, "And all the rest ran away from Nero and philosophy, both at once, and took to their heels." Apollonius gathers everyone left around him, and he gives a speech. This is the speech that I quoted at the start of this video, and also that I alluded to where he describes Nero as a wild beast. And he says it isn't right to blame anyone who ran away from Nero's persecution, but that the true philosophers are the ones who are willing to face their enemies head on and defend philosophy. That those who rise above their fear are the true philosophers. And he lays out the situation. Tyranny has taken hold of Rome, and it is up to courageous philosophers to fight back against it. He and his followers then enter the city. Now, while he's in the city, the way that Apollonius fights back is not to openly slander the emperor or make all these big speeches about tyranny and how the emperor is bad. It's just to go about his way of life as he normally does, talk to people, help them, encourage them, visit temples, help the priests correct their rites, which is something that we haven't really talked about, but that's something that he does everywhere he goes, and just to live his life as he always does, in sort of defiance of the anti-philosophical policies that are in place in Rome. Now, this is not true of Demetrius, who is another philosopher that Apollonius is friends with and associates with. Demetrius is going around talking bad about Nero the entire time, and because Apollonius is associated with Demetrius, they put a warrant out for Apollonius's arrest. And yet, when the imperial officer comes to arrest Apollonius, he takes out his scroll to read the charges, and the page is blank. All of the charges have mysteriously disappeared. And having no charges, he cannot arrest Apollonius. In fact, he is afraid to do so because he suspects that Apollonius has somehow magically made this happen, and that Apollonius is not quite human, but some kind of supernatural daimon. So the imperial officer just can't do anything about it, and he has to let him go. Remember in the beginning the words of Proteus that Apollonius's mother would bear a child very much like himself, someone who can evade capture. The last major episode in Book 4 is, well, you decide what to think about this. One day, Apollonius encounters a funeral for a young woman who has died on her wedding day. And he asks the mourners for the girl's name, and he goes over to the body and whispers something to it, and the girl wakes up and is alive. And Philostratus says, quote, "Now, whether he detected some spark of life in her which those who were nursing her had not noticed, for it is said that although it was raining at the time, a vapor went up from her face, or whether her life was really extinct, and he restored it by the warmth of his touch, is a mysterious problem which neither I myself nor those who were present could decide." Even in this moment, Philostratus is hesitant to classify or categorize what kind of powers Apollonius has access to. He says, it's possible that because philosophers are trained to notice things, that he just noticed that she in fact was alive. And look, that can happen, right? You hear horror stories about that. So it's possible that that's what happened, that he just noticed that she was alive and pointed it out, or he's magic. We are at the midpoint now of the biography. So what have we learned so far about Apollonius and about philosophy in general? Let's review. First, philosophy as a discipline. 1. Philosophy is achievable by anyone. It is a practice and a lifestyle that does not set limits on one's status in society. And philosophy is teachable. Apollonius teaches Damis and uses philosophy to help people improve their lives, like those who come to the temple of Asclepius for healing, and like his own brother. Number 2. Philosophy opens doors and puts you in a favorable position. Apollonius advises and chastises kings and emperors, like the king who visits the Indian sages that Apollonius reduces to tears. It also gives Apollonius a reason to travel the world, even beyond the scope of the Roman Empire. His journey east to the Indian sages shapes and molds his character and beliefs, and at the end of his travels, he seems to be more powerful than he was before. Number 3, philosophy gives you access to magic powers? Apollonius seems to be able to do things that others can't do, like making predictions, possibly cloning himself, getting a private audience with the ghost of the most famous Greek hero at Troy, evading arrest because the arrest warrant mysteriously disappeared, and of course, raising the dead? And that's not even to get into the miracles that the Indian sages perform, like levitating and healing people. And lastly, number 4. To be a philosopher requires both discipline and courage. Apollonius demands of himself and of his followers, especially Damis, that if they truly want to call themselves philosophers, they have to give up certain pleasures of life, like drinking, eating meat. They have to resist the pressure to cave to anti-philosophical movements, especially coming from the emperor. They have to put themselves in danger, no matter what, in order to defend and promote philosophy as a way of life. In terms of the content of philosophy that we've learned so far, here are the major highlights. Number 1. Reincarnation is real because the soul is immortal. Pythagoras was reincarnated from one of the soldiers at Troy, Iarchas was reincarnated from a king who was also a demigod, and Apollonius himself was reincarnated from a sailor. Number 2. Philosophy and popular religion are not mutually exclusive. Like I said, we didn't really talk very much about how Apollonius frequently visits temples and advises the priests how best to conduct rituals and prayers, but he does this. And in the beginning, if you remember, we learned that Pythagoras had a special, somehow direct access to the gods who told him how to live. So if Apollonius is modeled after Pythagoras, we can assume that he has the same kind of special access as well. And that's why he's able to advise the priests of the temples. Number 3, it's important to notice everything and to question everything. The episode where Apollonius and Damis are talking about elephants shows that you can deduce certain truths, even about things you don't understand, from things you already know and from context clues. Sort of an early scientific method or epistemology. And when Iarchas explains his reinterpretation of the stories of Minos and Tantalus, Apollonius changes his view, the one he presumably took on board when he first learned these myths, because Iarchas laid out a reasonable argument. And lastly, especially in Book 4, we get to see philosophy juxtaposed with leadership. Nero is obviously a negative example, but we also see positive ones like Phraotes, the king of Toxila, who is a better ruler because he has studied and believes in philosophy. Nero, on the other hand, is given a terrible review because, number 1, his behavior is not the behavior of a philosopher or someone who has studied philosophy. He's ridiculed for his performative conduct and his violence, especially against his mother. Number 2, he has made himself an enemy of philosophy by making decrees against practicing philosophy. In fact, at the very tail end of Book 4, he makes it illegal to practice philosophy openly in the city of Rome, and he imprisons philosophers like Musonius. Number 3, most importantly, he is shown to be weaker than philosophy and philosophers. Apollonius makes predictions about Nero that come true, like the cutting of the isthmus, and imperial attempts to curb philosophy fail when they get to Apollonius. The arrest warrant disappears. So this is where we're at when we get to the midpoint of the story. Nero is kind of like the boss battle at the end of a level in a video game. Apollonius hasn't beaten the game yet, but he has defeated a major enemy and hit a checkpoint, and he can go on now and continue to do what he does and live how he lives from this point onward. So Book 4 closes like this. Quote, "When Nero took his departure for Greece, after issuing a proclamation that no one should teach philosophy in public at Rome, Apollonius turned his steps to the western regions of the earth, which they say are bounded by the pillars, because he wished to visit and behold the ebb and flow of the ocean and the city of Gadara. For he had heard something of the love of wisdom entertained by the inhabitants of that country, and of how great an advance they had made in religion. And he was accompanied by all his pupils, who approved no less of the expedition than they did of the sage." At the midpoint in the story, Apollonius is on his way to another adventure. And so that's where we're going to leave it for today. We will pick up at this point next time. Again, I apologize that we're doing this in 2 parts, but as you can see by the length of this video and the hoarseness of my voice, it is just not possible to cover it all in one episode. So that's where I'm going to leave it. Thank you very much for watching. If this is interesting to you, if you liked this video, you can let me know by leaving a thumbs up down below. And if you want to see part 2, or really it's part 3 of the series, but the second half of the biography, feel free to hit the subscribe button. And as always, I'm really anxious to hear what you think about all of this stuff in the comments. So let me know any thoughts that you have, any questions about Apollonius, any ideas that are coming to mind here from what you know about Greek philosophy or Roman philosophy. Let me know all of that in the comments down below. So that's all I have for you today. I gotta go catch a flight. Like Apollonius, I'm on my own journey to the west. So that's it for me. Thank you all for watching. I truly appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one.